2024, the Major John Leroy Haynes Florida Veterans History Program was created to collect and preserve the stories and experiences of Florida's veterans and to recognize the state of Florida's military contribution throughout our nation's history. Through recorded interviews, the Florida Veterans History Program Oral History Collection acts as a living archive of first-hand accounts to capture the details of military service and the voices, memories, and reflections of the Floridians who served. The Major John Leroy Haynes Florida Veterans History Program is operated by the Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture's Florida Folklife Program. Together, we are proud to ensure that Florida's military history is preserved, honored, and shared. My name is Julian Duncan with the Florida Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, Florida Folklife Program. Today is August 3rd, 2025. The time is 10:39 a.m., and I'm interviewing Amy Evans in Ocala, Florida. Also present is Zachary Moreau. This interview is being conducted for the Major John Leroy Haynes Florida Veterans History Program and will additionally be submitted to the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. Good morning, Ms. Evans.
Good morning, Julian.
How are
Good
you doing
morning,
today?
Zach. I'm doing well, thank you.
Great. So to begin this interview, can you tell me a little bit about where you grew up, what your family was like?
I grew up in, yes, I'll be glad to. I grew up in an academia family. So we moved probably 2 or 3 times. I'm one of 4 siblings, and my dad was a professor, and well, he was a Renaissance man. He had quite a lot of different uh, careers, one of which was academia. The other was he was a pastor and a minister most of his life. My mother was a nurse, but she was a stay-at-home mom. And we moved from the Midwest, from Wisconsin to New Hampshire and Vermont when I was transitioning through high school and through middle school and then high school. So I ended up in Dover, New Hampshire. My dad was at the University of New Hampshire for approximately 36 years. And then my life was filled with music, with art, and with culture. We were not allowed to have television in the house. I think my parents acquired their first television after we all went off to school or to pursue our different careers. But anyway, having said that, so we were pretty focused on athletics and academics and art.
And music was a big part of your life as well, right?
Music was the main part of my life. We
Just a
had
little bit about that?
Yes, I was an oboist. My father would take us to Carnegie Hall young people's concerts at a very early age. I think when I was 7, the concert, there was a young Jewish child prodigy on stage. And he was 13 and he was an oboist. And I pointed to him and I said, I want to play that. And my father said, no, no, you don't want to play that. He said, you have to make oboe reeds and it's a difficult, instrument. It's a double reed instrument. So it's like playing the violin or even the French horn if you have to transpose everything. But anyway, I stuck to it. At the age of 5, I decided I was going to be an oboist. In our family, we had to study 2 years on the piano and then we could pick our instrument. So at the age of 7, I was able to finally be able to play the oboe and continue on with my piano lessons, as did my siblings as well. They each picked a different instrument. And that carried me on through college and high school, then on college. On the other source, my father was heavily into the classics and history. And so we always had history lessons and we had to write theses and theories, sometimes even before we had dinner. So sort of it's aligned with the movie called A River Runs Through It, where all the boys wanted to go out fly fishing, but they had to sit in the library and write a perfect paper for their father, who was also a pastor, by the way. I think Tom Skerritt played the role, but it had a lot of what I grew up in, sort of very similar atmosphere. My parents were historians. We lived in old homes during the summertime and school vacations. We would restore them. And so we traveled all over the world practically restoring old hop properties, and then they would sell them off and buy an older one. And by the time I was in high school, my last foray at home, I had a walk-in fireplace in my own bedroom. It was such a, I think it was 1742 was the last home that we owned in New Hampshire, Nottingham, New Hampshire. But anyway, so my life was a balance of that, and then scholastics were certainly their schooling and focusing on our studies. We always had to have very good grades that we had to bring home, and my father and mother would fill in, where the schools left off. So I consider that I was very blessed with a family and a solid family education. The other part then was church. We always went to church, and we had Bible stories, and we had always had a full life. We never knew that we were missing television or anything else that today I think it wouldn't be very popular.
Mm.
Wouldn't be possible to raise your children without electronics today. So, but anyway,
So, when did the Coast Guard become something that was starting to
relevant.
enter the picture?
Yeah. I was playing with the Boston Youth Symphony in Boston at the time. We lived just about 45 miles north in New Hampshire. And so on the weekends, I would study with the Boston Pops oboist, and then I would spend 5 hours in rehearsal with this youth symphony. And so I was playing, and my senior year in high school, and of course we had to branch out, and I had several opportunities. My sister had gone the administrative route, and then my brother, who was a genius, had gone to college, and then I was headed to New Hampshire, the University of New Hampshire, because as my father was on staff there, we had a considerable discount. But I also was accepted into New England Conservatory for my oboe. And then I was accepted in the secretarial school that my sister went, was in Catherine Gibbs in Boston. And then I had a chance to go to be an airline stewardess. We were called stewardesses at the time because of my bilingual French background. And so I decided that the most relevant and the easiest way to get promoted and to move on would be go in. My father had always wanted somebody in the service, one of his children, to go play John Philip Sousa. And so I, being very close to my dad, my dear, dear father, I decided that I would, go into the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard was looking for females that year, was the first year they had let women go into active duty. And
And what year was this?
that was 1974. Um, actually 73, but it was December of 73 when they signed the paperwork. But 74 is when the first class of enlisted women were going through. They didn't have officers in the Coast Guard unless they were reservists or left over from what they used to call the spars. And we were no longer spars. We were called WOGs, Women of the Guard. I remember that. But the very first year they let women go direct active duty, they also coincided that with moving the Coast Guard band from New London, Connecticut to Washington, D.C. for the PR purposes. And as all the other services had held their concert bands in Washington, D.C., they thought it would be time that the Coast Guard is there as well. At this time, just a little background relevancy is would be the Coast Guard was not Department of Defense. It had its own bill that would pass through Congress each year. And this was before the Homeland Security was created. So we were always trying to make sure we were treated similar and the same. Well, anyway, I was busy playing my oboe. The instrument that they were looking for in the Coast Guard band was an oboist. And one of them, there was an opening for a French horn player, an oboist, and I think the timpani player was position became, because if the band moved from New London, Connecticut to Washington, then there would be a lot of the musicians that had been with a band that did not re-up because their families and their businesses were steadfast in New London, Connecticut, and they chose not to leave and be well, anyway, they chose not to leave New London.
Mhm.
So anyway, I auditioned I think it was in February of my senior year in high school, and I was accepted as an oboist. And then I went, and they put me in a what they called a delayed enlistment program because I was still in high school. But I was sworn in, I believe, in February of '74, and in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And then I went back and went to school and finished school. And that year, the Boston Youth Symphony Orchestra took several trips overseas. So I was very busy at home finishing up my high school studies, and also finishing up everything at home in preparation for moving on. Um, in July, or at late June, July, I got off the plane from playing in Bogota and Colombia, and Medellin was an amazing tour. We had, well, anyway, I won't go into it, but it was an extremely exciting tour. At that time, Colombia was full of drugs and it was very dangerous. So we had escorts everywhere, and we were cautioned heavily not to use marijuana or and a lot of the musicians, disregarded that, but we all still came home on a plane. But anyway, I got off the plane from an exciting tour with the Boston Youth Symphony Orchestra, and then got on another plane the next day and headed, or a bus, excuse me, and headed down to, Cape May, New Jersey, which is where they, had the women that were being inducted into the Coast Guard. And there at Cape May, there were 32 or 3,600 men, and there were like 32 women that were inducted into and went through boot camp in that session. So, and that session lasted for, I believe it was 9 weeks at the time. We had boot camp, and it was later on that they opened up a boot camp on the West Coast for women. Um, they had one on the West Coast for men, but they allowed the women to go to Alameda. But it was at the time, if you were a female in the Coast Guard, then you were siphoned off into to Cape May, New Jersey. So we had no uniforms. I remember walking around in a skirt and heels. At the very first July, it was hot in the summer in New Jersey and very humid. And we were treated very well. I mean, sometimes we got to hold our books or the guys' books, and they had to get down and give them 20 if they, so, so we were treated a little differently, I have to admit. But we still got you got the treatment of what boot camp was like and had the feel of it. So I made it into a game. I had to in order to get through it, because some weren't so lucky. But I enjoyed myself thoroughly, and I learned a little about the Coast Guard. Of course, I had this billet that I was already assigned to, so I had no worries where I was going. It was while I was in boot camp that I learned that my fellow coasties did not know where they were going yet. A lot of them hadn't been. Some of them been signed preschools, but a good portion of them hadn't. So they were a little bit nervous about that. So anyway, the I think the most interesting factor is halfway through boot camp, I learned that the Coast Guard band was not being moved to New London, Connecticut, or to Washington from New London. And so subsequently, all of the musicians decided to re up for 6 years. So the billets were no longer open. And so I was like some of those in my colleagues in boot camp. I had nowhere to go, but I had already signed up an oath of office for 4 years at the time was our tour of duty. So, I did receive, they had the Coast Guard was in turmoil at the time, and in a good way. It was a lot of undergoing a lot of change. I don't mean to be negative, but one of the changes had been a lot of their A schools and their C schools were being moved around, shut down, and relocated to other. The yeoman position, which is what I eventually found a slot with, was moved from New York to California. So I was one of the first to go through and experience the yeoman school in California. So after boot camp, I did receive a billet, and then once I was in yeoman school in California, that took me through December of '74. I was able to, I graduate and then got orders to Oklahoma. At the last minute, they changed those, and I went back to the Coast Guard Academy, where I fulfilled my 4-year career in the Coast Guard.
Two follow-up questions on your entry into service. First of all, so you went in 1974. It's the first year that women are allowed to enlist in the Coast Guard. How did it feel being kind of part of a historic moment?
Frankly, I was very busy. So, but my father instilled that. That's a good question. My father impressed that upon me, that it was, we're going to be held as examples, and to make sure that we abided by everything. And our my recruiter, eh, they kept impressing upon us that the Coast Guard was being very picky about who they were picking. So that sort of fed my ego. But, when I got in, I learned, and my peers were all from like kids like me,
Mm.
from different schools and different, backgrounds all across the United States. The one thing we all had common, and my father did, he grew up on boats. We all had a love of the sea and the lore.
Mm.
And they frankly knew more about the Coast Guard than I did. I was more, music affiliated. But, as I learned as I stayed and worked in the Coast Guard, I became more and more, um, accustomed and attuned to the fact that we were, trailblazers, groundbreaking histories. We had no uniforms, so we first, had they made uniforms for us, and then we were always in the spotlight about pictures about being this is what the uniforms look like. And so it was sort of something we just absorbed, like it was like osmosis, and it really didn't make an impact until probably later on. And certainly now, when we're looking back and thinking, wow, well, I mean, that was really different. Most of my high school peers were all going to, local universities and colleges, and not some of them had, aspirations for West Point and stuff like that because of their family. But I was definitely the first, and I even all through my career in the Coast Guard, and then later on, I had a pretty busy business career, where every time they would play the Semper Paratus, for Veterans Day or something, I would be the only one in the 3,000 people standing up. Coast Guard! Everybody gets up and yay! And I see the Coast Guard. So it was continuously impressed upon me that it was something different. After the Coast Guard, I did. I we had a family tragedy. My husband and I became divorced, and, so a new phase of life started, and I had to go back to work and, support the children. They were college bound, and I had, you know, um, a lot of, fiscal responsibilities. So, I was lucky enough to find a job in the Research Triangle Park in Raleigh, in North Carolina, and, with DuPont. And so DuPont took me up for 8 years and trained me, and, I became, uh, that's how I started my career after the Coast Guard. And it was a shock. I had to shop on the economy the first time for my groceries and not on the base. And my husband and I had been in the Coast Guard collectively over 30 years, so it was sort of a shock. But anyway, I worked for DuPont for 8 years, and, gradually, became in a position where I could support my 2 children. I had a financial goal that I had to meet, and, as a secretary, I started out at the very low rungs on the ladder, and, moved up the corporate ladder pretty quickly, and was able to afford to put both children through college, and then, later on, supply post-grad or whatever I needed to do for them until they became self-sufficient, which they are. I have wonderful kids. But, during all of that time, I never worked for companies that were, politically aligned with my politics, which are very patriotic and have a lot of military. So it was always nice on Veterans Veterans Day or Memorial Day, when our companies did take that time off, and we'd all meet in the auditorium, and then they have a band there, and they play all the different service songs, and then they'd ask everybody, all the veterans, to stand up so they could put that little check mark off that they were. And then we got a little stick with a flag on it or something. But I was always the only one in the room that was stood up for the Coast Guard. And I stood right up all the time, and everybody would come up to me, wow, I didn't know you were in the service. I said, yes, I was. Started my whole career. But I was very proud, and churches did the same everywhere we go. The United States, I found, wherever we lived, people really have a true fever for patriotism. And even though I think today the education system lacks the history that I know that I have growing up in the history courses to incite that or make it curious for students, there still is a modicum of patriotism that runs through the core of no matter what, if you're in the military or if you're in corporate America, if you're um, in church, what field you ever go into, there is an awareness that, and everybody knows what, the flag is, and what the anthem, and the proper etiquette towards that. So anyway, and now, of course, here in the villages, it's celebrated all the time. We have a massive amount of veterans in the villages, and we have a memorial park, and they have, oh my gosh, I'm so busy going to those events. I do a lot of singing at them, but I also carry the Coast Guard flag still. So well, we have an honor guard, and we have a little ceremony on the park all the time. So I'm blessed to be able to do that on behalf of the women veterans here.
Can we go back to the moment in boot camp when you found out that you weren't going where you thought you were going? And can you tell me a little bit about how that felt? And then also what yeoman school looked like, what kind of work you were preparing to do, and what the training was like.
Sure. Um, I really enjoyed boot camp. I'm not saying everybody does. It's not for everybody, but I have a personality that seems that looks on the bright side. And so I was going all guns unloaded at the time, and it seemed just like a little zigzag for me. Um, by that time, I was, as I said, gung ho, and I was devastated that I couldn't play my oboe in the band, because that's all I knew. I was very confident and comfortable with that. But I also thought, well, shoot, maybe I'll go if I go to yeoman school, then and I was headed to Oklahoma City, where they had the Coast Guard Institute, which produced all the policies and the manuals in the Coast Guard, which I thought aligned with my high school background and my administrative um, knowledge. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go um, marry a cowboy. Yeah, don't they have rodeos out in Oklahoma or something? So I always put a silly kind of a positive spin to it. But I did eventually end up in New London, and I was hoping they sort of put a tag. I always had exciting positions. I was very outgoing. I had was always excellent in school and scholastics. Later on, that's why they allowed me into the Coast Guard Academy. I don't know if I'd ever gotten through chemistry and the first, physics and trigonometry. I mean, it just went bam, 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 semester after semester. And that math was not my background in education growing up. But having said that, I always got a lot of attention, and I never was distracted. I wasn't one to be dating or doing some of the other things that the girls, so they sort of went off kilter to their careers. I was always focused on my career. If I would go to night school when I finally got stationed at the academy. Well, I fulfilled my position during the day, but then I would be going to school to continue my education at night until I met my husband. and then things sort of took a different turn.
Mm.
And then, but that ended up 2 years later, we got married, and about that sort of simultaneously, I had an offer to go to the academy, and then I had an offer to get married, and I chose to get married. That was in my upbringing. I always wanted a family. And quite frankly, the Coast Guard, I'd had 4 years of wonderful opportunities in the Coast Guard. I was in love with a man who was going to be an officer in the Coast Guard, and so I decided to fulfill certain requirements of my life and have fun and still stay in the Coast Guard with him for the next, I think it was about 22 years. We
And
were.
what during those 4 years, what kind of work were you doing at the Coast Guard Academy, and also what were you studying in the evenings?
Yes. Okay. In the Coast Guard Academy, put me on assignment to work for the executive director of the foundation. The foundation was a fundraising arm of the Coast Guard Academy that raised funds for the cadets for their hulls, their rowing hulls, which were quite expensive, um, and for all kinds of the different charities that were there to support the cadets. We had boats that they trained on. We had literature. They took trips. They supported the Coast Guard Eagle, which was the sailboat that was stationed at the pier of the academy. So it was a massive amount of fundraising and letter writing. And it was aligned with the alumni office. The academy is a 4-year accredited college. And so, like all other institutions, they have very specific, the registrar, the alumni, and then all the different branches of the Coast Guard were supported there. What was interesting at the time that I was there, it was not a management, you couldn't take a management course. They were located directly across the street from Connecticut College for women, and sometimes the cadets would join their college for classes that they needed in management or English or history. The history that they got in the Coast Guard Academy was, maritime history, things like that, aligned with the mission of the service at the time. But anyway, I worked in first in the executive fundraising office, and then soon after that, I was transferred to the record keeping office, where they held all the records for the staff, which would be all the enlisted personnel stationed there. And that's where I eventually met my husband. I had my auspices was from A to F in in the alphabet, and my husband's name was E. So I took care of his service record, and he was a naughty boy all the time. He was constantly jumping out of the women's dorms and window dorms and stuff, and getting in trouble. So he always appeared in front of me, and I had to do paperwork on him. And that's how I met him. So anyway, but that's a side story. But anyway, uh, uh, once I was in the at the foundation, backing it up before I was transferred to records, I supported 12 Coast Guard admirals and two very prominent businessmen from every state in the country. And that comprised the board of directors for the Coast Guard Academy, and siphoned all this money and these fundraising efforts into the Coast Guard. And they were very, very prominent. They gave the boats, the Cuyaholas, I think they were called. Mr. Cuyahola was one of our board members, and he donated all the training vessels that the cadets would use, during the summer or all year long in their training. And then Mr. Becton and Dickinson of Becton and Dickinson University were also main supporters of ours. But I held 4 board meetings every year for this board to get together, and did all the agendas. I supported the executive director, was a retired captain who was actually in charge of it, but I supported him, and I did most of the work for supporting that effort. And then I moved into the couple of years later. And so that I was still in a high profile position. I always got a lot of attention. And the uniforms came out finally. And I looked good in a uniform for Pete's sake. And so everybody was saying, wow, wow. So I always had sort of positions of either leadership or was always front and center because they liked to put me up. And I think I handled it pretty well. I was never arrogant or assuming. My Christian background made me humble and very grateful and my father helped install about being appreciative of what was going on at the time. So I got a lot of support, and a lot of those admirals and a lot of those board of directors helped me, wrote up recommendations for me to become one of the first women to get an appointment to the Coast Guard Academy. And, as I said, I did turn it down and I got married, but still, 10 years later, I would, bump into some of these guys and they'd say, "Why did you turn down the Coast Guard?" Yeah. And I said, "Well, I was in love." But, they said, "Do you know how hard we pushed for you to get in?" So, I was very flattering to hear, and it was nice, but it was, there in your life, and now as, on the other side of my career, I look back, you do have choices, and they do have consequences, and some good, some bad. But that was one of the apexes of my career, whether I was going to become an officer or whether I was going to get out and become a mother and a wife and a homemaker. And like my mother before me, my mother did the same thing. She had a huge career and she decided, well, she wasn't going to do that. She always wanted children and a family. And, it was, my later 20s, and I decided it was time to go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I might miss out on the opportunity, and family has always been very important to me.
And it sounds very full circle in a sense. I mean, you grew up in a family that valued education and academia. You went in for music. You ended up, your father was a college administrator, and
Yeah.
you ended up working in an academic admin position in the Coast Guard.
Yes, I did.
It's
It
just
was amazing.
correct,
Oh,
full circle.
I felt very comfortable. I didn't even think about it. It was sort of like home. You're right, Julian. You're right. That's a nice way to put it.
Um, so then going, I mean, and you've talked about a few minutes ago. You mentioned that you're in veterans organizations, part of the honor guard, carrying the Coast Guard flag. I mean, the Coast Guard's always been a part of your life, and so going on at this point in your life, transitioning from being a service member to being a Coast Guard spouse and raising a family. How was that period? What
Was
did that period
exciting.
look like?
My husband was, also very charismatic and intelligent, and quickly made rank, went up. He was, an amazing he had a great education, and he had grown up on boats, and, he had a lot of goals. He was a real go-getter. He was headed for being one of the first non-academy admirals in the Coast Guard at the time, and he was on track for that. And so I just followed him around. The children and I followed him everywhere, and we had exciting tours in Europe, um, preceded by several stints in language training school, immersion training for languages. So the family was all prepared for being immersed in different cultures around the world. He took several tours of duty away from the family that were located in Japan. And So we always had something going on. And our philosophy was never shut any doors or windows and always take every opportunity you can. And we did. We, put the kids in backpacks and went to Hawaii or, everywhere we went, we always took that opportunity to see more and do more. So it was very fast. And all of a sudden, boom, at 38, both he and I were ready to be discharged. We'd done our careers and it was like, what next? And by then, the Coast Guard had had their act together, and they were preparing people like ourselves after their 20-year stint, what they were going to do. And do you have all your college, credits in line? Do you have what you need, your skill sets credited, so you can go out and get a good job? And so, at the age of 38, we were looking beyond and for a whole new career. And at that time is when we separated, and he went on, and then I was left to go into the business world and seek my career elsewhere.
Hmm. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about your career in business and do you feel like there were ways that your background in the Coast Guard informed your work as a professional informed your daily life during this period of time?
Good question. It's in the discipline, and the focus, and then the absolute, in the military, it provides, there's so many opportunities, and, yeah, I don't think young people, it's not stressed enough, and young people are just unaware because they didn't have it in their family, or their were family members weren't aware to train them and coach them. Um, but I learned, through my experience in the military, to show up on time. It matters. That's what I still am challenged by that, but, also, that you're focused on, on in your work. You have experience, grounded experience, and that, to have a bigger picture when you go away, but also have a strategy on how you're going to move forward constantly. And those, types of, missions and those types of things help me to maneuver whatever I was faced with in the business world. And it was quite different, I have to say. I felt comfortable in one and then uncomfortable, and just it was an unknown territory and waters, which I had a strong family, so I never felt like, I was alone or drowning. But I, uh, I did. I had to be sharp. I had to be on time. I had to make the right decisions. No more poor choices. I had to make sure I had children that I had to look after, and so it was tough. But I always had. I credit the Coast Guard for preparing me for life after the Coast Guard, after military, and for whatever it threw at me. That's a good question.
Hmm. Um, yeah, and I want to look a little bit about at like veterans organizations and things like that in your life outside of, so you've got your life in the business world that's been affected by, what kind of veterans organizations were you a part of at this point of time, or were you a part of veterans organizations?
Always, if there was a veterans group, or I've always had, I was, when I left the Coast Guard, I was on a service disability,
Mm.
which is I am today. I'm a disabled veteran, believe it or not, of the Vietnam era war. Um, but so I've always been closely aligned medically to military establishments, no matter where I roam. Here in Florida, even in retirement, I seek my medical care at the VA in Gainesville, which
Mm.
has a very good reputation because it's aligned with the Florida University Medical School, which also has a great reputation. Formerly, in North Carolina, I was aligned with the VA in Asheville, which also has the same type of um, relationship with local universities. So I've been very lucky and very grateful for the medical care I've been given over the years. And that has kept me aligned. But through that also, I've been aligned with several women's organizations. In smaller communities, they're both men and women, but in some of the larger cities, like in retirement here, I've been able to gravitate, or gradually go to uh, some of the organizations that are mainly just for women. And this one I found here in the villages, just blows my mind away. There are 384 of us on roster. I am not the most active. A lot of my peers here are just amazing women. They're fully retired, and so it becomes their full-time job, and um, they are just as tenacious and persevering as if they were in their careers before. And we have tentacles in all parts of the community here. We're all sisters in the hood, kind of thing. We go to all the parades together. They have golfing sessions together. They just do everything. You can get involved in everything. Which it just and then but the most impressive part for me is to learn from my sisters from other organizations, other military organizations, and to feel like, wow, some of them are a little older than I am. And in the Navy and the Army and the Air Force, women were accepted and different times in their different prospective services. So, our respective services. So, we don't all have the same story or the same career background, but most of them have the same. They'd come and there were no uniforms or there were no toilet facilities, head facilities for women because they were trailblazers for women in their own way. And I mean, some of them went on and stayed in the service full time, unlike myself. But then they transitioned into what we call service jobs today outside. Their contractor positions, and they were just as trailblazers then as they were after their 20 years were over. They had another 20-year career in the service as contractors. And I did that once when I got out of the service. I was a contractor for a fundraiser group for the Coast Guard had, or it was the Navy, had contracted out their entire HR organization. And so I became part of that a group, a team that went and bid for that in Washington, D.C. I wrote policy for that in that position. I had a captain who had retired and liked me. And so he said he went to this organization. It was called RTI International. And they went out and they bid on these huge projects for military projects. And so we went and we won that project. And so RTI was the contractor that reorganized all the human resources functions within, I think, a certain branch of the Navy. It was really impressive. But that was a year-long project that we had to put together and work on. It was really a lot of fun. But a lot of those women I'm finding here sort of did the same, and they were forerunners and trailblazers because women weren't that prominent in their services either, as far as direct or full time. So it's sort of fun. We all look back and we make fun about, the underwear that we had issued to us that we had to wear, and all kinds of solicitation stuff like that. It's better than talking about the lettuce in the commissary. We all have a lot of fun, and we meet all the time in the villages. I get anytime I can take off from my current positions because I work full time still, and I probably will until I'm 90. I'm like my dad, we just work and work and work. But um, uh, I enjoy getting out and being amongst people and learning something new every day. And I like to be involved with people who are like-minded, that they have places to go, they're constantly moving forward or getting involved in other things. So even though I'm getting a little older and I have to take a nap or two now to be able to keep up with my own schedule, I still do sincerely believe in keeping busy. That'll keep all the cobwebs out and you could probably live longer. But I get to meet a lot of amazing people that way.
How do you feel uh, the Coast Guard, the service in general, military contracting, even the broader world um, around service has what changes have you observed from coming in as a trailblazer in 1974, the first class of women in the Coast Guard, to over your career? What kind of changes have you observed for in the service in general, but also for women in the service?
Well, that's a good question. Back then I was starry-eyed and, rose-colored glasses, and I was really focused on just, accomplishing from one step to the other. As I progressed through, and then, even though I got out, I was always in the Coast Guard because my husband was in the Coast Guard. And we had, I think, about 20 years of my young life, my formative years, um, were in a military environment. And so I think looking at women, and then by then knowing there were women in other services, we would compare a lot. And I think it became more and more open minded. When I first came in, we had posters all over with these big, heavy chiefs saying, if God wanted women in the Coast Guard, he would have issued them in our ditty bags. So it was sort of that mentality. And of course, I was primed and educated to ignore that kind of thing. But it really was something that was very prevalent in the service. And since I was so starry eyed, I never let it set me back. If I bumped up against a gentleman, or there were a lot of, I have to laugh. There were a lot of issues with females in the beginning, no matter what, whether it was at the academy or whether it was in the enlisted ranks in New Jersey or California. Women were targeted back then because we were changing culturally outside of the military too. There was this cultural dogma about a place for what women should be and should adhere to. And I, growing up in my own family, I never had that. My parents never instilled that in me. They did not lead into the feminist movement that all women were equal to men. They just sort of kept us focused on being busy on more positive things. And so we always were told we could do anything we want, and we did, and accomplish anything as long as we worked hard for it. And everything was going to be based on merit. Um, and my folks were not, had installed upon us that no matter, what culture you were from, background you were from, whether it was economic, socioeconomic, or was ethnicity, that you all had the same chances. We were in the United States, for Pete's sake. So I came in pretty broad-minded, but I was forced with a lot of dogma, a lot of stereotypes were thrown at me. And if I laughed them off or got through them, then I was considered shallow and, probably not the best. But I was not. I was very focused on that. I had friends from all walks of life in the service, and later on in my career, I spent a lot of, I would tend to gravitate towards international companies because they had international cultures and different people from different backgrounds. So I tended to do well in those. So I didn't have a hard time. But I'm not going to say that I don't recognize that women did move along and evolved into, there were more quarters for them. It was easier for them. When you were married, if you married a spouse in the service, back then you were told not to get married because there was no guarantee you'd be with them. Today, I've learned just recently, with my friend's granddaughter graduating from the Air Force, she and her husband both went into boot camp, and they're both guaranteed, a school after boot camp. And then, researching that, there is a policy that they do put, women with their husbands, and that was sort of unheard of when I came in. So gradually, and I think, well, I know for a fact with the Coast Guard, the politics of the time have impacted it all along. Um, when my daughter was college age and we were doing college searches, I was interested and her dad we were both interested in having her pursue a Coast Guard career. She could have gone to the academy, and she's very bright and could have probably gotten in. So we took a trip back to New London, and I yeah, we decided not to go with the Coast Guard Academy. It was just so politically run. The town wasn't 20 years later, the town had deteriorated. It was very disappointing. And she instead went into Air Force ROTC and went to Penn State University. And then actually got out of that and went into architecture and became an architect through Penn State. So, but we did try and explore. And I noticed that at that time when we visited the Coast Guard Academy, I had remembered that when I was there, Agnew, who was a president briefly, because I believe it was oh, well, anyway, he came and spoke to our graduating class of cadets, and he mentioned, well, how come I don't see any, black cadets here, African Americans? And so the mission changed within the Coast Guard to recruit, and they had difficulty doing that. But for the 20 years that I got out and then my daughter was ready to go to college, we didn't see any white people cadets at the academy. They had all kinds of ethnicity at the academy, and had literally changed the whole face of it. So, I guess that would be great, but I was always for more equilibrium and more um, generative society where every walk of life was represented. So we were a little disappointed. Today I'm told that's not so. I'm very much part of a Coast Guard group as well as the women's group here, And we've taken several trips back to the academy, and that isn't so. I see, a lot of young men and women from all walks of life. So I think and the city has revived. When we were there looking for Autumn's um, college, the windows were boarded up. They were going. I think New London was going through a really tough time at the time. So having said that, little bits and pieces. I'm not an expert on it, but I would say women have come a long way in the service, and they are generally met um, and well respected. And I'll tell you what, for me, when I first was in business, I worked for men, and in the Coast Guard, I certainly worked for men. But later on in my years, as I became more and more senior in the position or in the company, I worked for a lot of really outstanding females. And I can tell you that there are women in the services in all the academies, in all the branches that are just amazing. And now that they're retired, well, it's a joy to be able to talk to them and learn from them and see what they experienced and went through. And they never give up. And I'd go to war with any of them, and that's the whole mission, right? I call them all my sisters, sisters in the hood.
So, just thinking about your life today, and we've touched a little bit on veterans organizations, but your lifelong love of music and your lifelong affiliation with the Coast Guard, how do these two things play out in your daily life today?
It's the patriotic part of the service that still is very dear to me. You know, every year we have many, many ceremonies that we can participate, and we all wear our uniforms and we sing and we wave the flags. But it's good to see that they're young people. We have a group that's really focused on um, handing that down to the young people. We're very aware how important that is. And so we go into the schools and we work with that. My current job, I have a new position and I plan to implement a music program in that position. And there'll be a lot of patriotic songs because then that'll lead into the history part of their country. And I think in the situation I'm going to be working with, it'll be helpful and it'll be a learning tool. It's never negative, it's only a positive source. And it's an education in itself, in and among itself. And so I think it can help. It'll be a good service. And I feel good doing it.
That's great.
So it's been very much part of my life after actually serving. It's to keep the patriotism always aware in the current generation and for generations. And that's part of our job here, our short time on earth, is to do that, I feel.
I agree. What would you say if you were to offer counselor advice to a young person considering a career in the military, or maybe not considering a career in the military, or looking ahead at life? What's some kind of a counsel you would offer?
First, I look into the military service. Uh, I'm told that the recruitment numbers are the highest ever right now, currently. During this administration, I think everything has rebounded. Formally, I would not probably not have said that. I'd say be careful, but I'm told that and that there are so many opportunities. You can go to college, you can do what you want, you could work in your career that you aspire to. You can find a career if you don't have one. There are a lot of children today in our society. I think we're so affluent that we want to give our children everything. And so when they actually are at the point where they have to stand up for themselves and decide for themselves what they want to do, they don't know. And so the service is a good pause. It's never changed. It was for me. It's a good pause from severe academic studies in high school and then more severe ones in college. And it gives you sort of a pauser. Eine kleine Pauser in German, they say, just to sit back and say, okay, do I want to do this? In some of the wealthier families in the United States or the more affluent families, they allow their children to take a year off before they go to Harvard or whatever school they get into. But some of them, they go work in cotton fields in Puerto Rico, or they go into manufacturing plants on the lines. Their parents want them to get the idea of they're not privileged. Life is not privileged. Life has to be earned. Then and give them sort of a sense of really what we used to call liberal arts education, which basically doesn't exist anymore in our college programs that are offered. So I think I would, unless there are two types of students. There are some with burning passions. They know what they want to do, and my daughter, for instance, had her bag packed at 7. She was going to be an architect, right? So that was it, right? Well, my son, it was a little difficult to find out what Isaac wanted to do, right? But with those two, you can take a pause in the military and explore whether you really wanted to become an architect, or if there was something else that you were more geared to as an adult, and then explore options that you hadn't even heard of or thought of. And most military services offer such a wide array of, you can be an engineer, you can be a nurse. I mean, you can be a teacher, you can do anything you want. And the military will pay for it if you're from a less blessed family, or it can provide you sort of a year off or a year or two off to say, hey, is this what I really want to do? And then actually work in that program to see if you like to do it. So I have always been pro positive for any young people wanting to explore the service. And there are some the Marines, and those are for children that grew up in families that really like, gung ho, and really get off on that. But having said that, and having just come back from a graduation in the Air Force, um, the mission of the services are to, protect our country in times of war. And so I always impress upon that it's not just getting a college education for free or going to see if you want to become a nurse or not, that there's an underwriting story as to why you're in the service. And if you can, I think that's really important to relay, because our freedoms are never free. We have to fight for them, and sometimes, unfortunately, die for them and give up the main sacrifice. And I know that's not taught in our culture today outside of the military. So it's a good reminder. And I think, if we're going to have a country, we do have to continue that reminder, um, and also provide, a stable income and a career choice. I mean, it's just, and overall, I would say it's the best liberal arts education around is to be in the military. People from different cultures in life don the same uniform. There's no difference. So one can't outdress the other. You don't know where they're from, but you all have to do, and you're all in the same mission, and you learn the same skill set. And then you can branch out into individuals, and there just is nothing negative about it. It's all positive. It's only 3 to 4 years, mainly 2 or 3 years in some of the other services of your life. I know in Europe, having lived in Europe, they have a integrated system like that as well. All of the young men and women, South Korea, in Europe, and in France and in Germany, all have to serve time out of high school. They don't have the regs in the Marine Corps and the regiment like the Chinese do and that we do to a certain extent. But I don't know, they do in South Korea. Their mission is, protect their country, but then they go on to whatever that they were taught to in the service. So it really is almost every democratic country in the world, and some Marxist countries. They infiltrate the service, and I think it's to remind everybody that it's our country, offerings are not free. There is a price to pay. So I don't see any better education in the war that could be had. And to miss all out on it, is you're missing out on part of life, I think.
Mm.
So
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. Thank you for that. Is there anything in this interview that we have not covered that you would like to say?
no, I think we pretty well covered it. I'm just very proud to be a veteran. I'm so proud that my parents, had the foresight to offer that opportunity, whether it was through music or not. But it has formed me and created me as an adult and as a mother, that I turned around and taught that to my children. And so I'm very proud of that as well. No matter what walks of life they may enter, they will always have that to think and hearken back to, which is very important. And I hope they give that to their children. That's what I can hope for. If they don't, grandma will.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to say thank you for your time today, and thank you for your service.
As yours as well. Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure.